Slavery. Such an evil word, yet it has existed for about 11,000 years. From the time agriculture started to boom, it was soon discovered that indentured servants and slaves were far cheaper than a regular workforce. But where did the idea come from? And how does 11,000 years add up to today, where in the United States, the ill effects of slavery are completely felt? Join Liber-Tea now for a closer look at the cost, tragedy, and some of the heroism of slavery. Although we'll focus our attention on a more modern-day perspective, we'll reach back in time to see how, where, and why slavery ends up costing more in the end than what is actually saved, and the courage of free men who acted honorably in the face of dangerous, evil men. Like, subscribe, comment, and share your thoughts and stories on this horrific crime. To be clear, slavery is actually kidnapping. Kidnapping is defined in Britannica Encyclopedia as the unlawful taking away a person by force or by fraud and holding them against their will. Although we often don't refer to slavery as kidnapping, that's exactly what it was. And unfortunately, it happens still today, although not as blatant as in years past. We've already talked about the very beginning, the roots of slavery, so let's fast forward a few thousand years to a few hundred years ago. While there are many slaves in U.S. history who were war prisoners, Native Americans, and other minority groups, we'll concentrate our efforts on shining a light on the dark facts of slaves directly kidnapped from the continent of Africa. Although 1619 is recorded as the very beginning of slavery, with a Dutch ship carrying about 20-plus slaves into the harbors of Virginia, the actual influx of transatlantic slave trade that made the biggest impact on American history didn't start until around the end of the 17th century. Let's be clear at this point, Africans were kidnapped and stripped of every human right and basically became the status of chattel, someone's personal possession, and this would continue on for the next few centuries. These chattel were whipped, beaten, abused, raped, burned, maimed, and many other dreadful acts merely for cheap, free labor. Religious sermons were delivered that this was God's will, and many clergymen passionately preached this to their constituents. The scientists of the day made discovery after discovery that black men, women, and children were less evolved, an inferior race. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the economic importance and opportunities set in stone that slavery would be here to stay. Since the beginning of U.S. slavery is well documented, we'll begin there. While many other nationalities were responsible for the slave trade, the British masters were the major importers of specifically African slaves to the New World, which is why very often in our history books and memories, this marks the start of slavery as we know it today. However, we can often mistake this as the actual start. The European trade of slaves in slave labor is actually much more complicated, and the roots of it runs deeper than what is taught in school books. Because of all of this, it is helpful to understand the larger historical and cultural picture, a picture centuries older than what we assume, which in turn helps us understand exactly why prejudice runs so deep. It is interesting to know that the first African to come to the U.S. was most likely a free man named Juan Garrido, who was born in what is now called Angola, and traveled with Juan Ponce de Leon to Puerto Rico in 1508. Here is actually where much of the U.S. slavery story begins. Puerto Rico is most likely where the first African slaves were imported to. St. Augustine, Florida, was the first established settlement where slaves were brought to serve the new colony, but also included in this group were free men as well from Africa. St. Augustine would become an important trading post for slavery. However, the very beginning had a more mixed view, mixing free and indentured Africans. In later years, Florida would become the state with the largest population of free Africans before the national liberation. In the next few years, other large population of free Africans would grow in the Chesapeake Bay region, the same landing point with the actual captives who came to the Virginia settlement in 1619. During this beginning time, slavery had different meanings for different groups of people. Indentured servants were given contracts where they were commissioned to serve a period of time, often around 7 years, to work off the cost of their passage to North America, plus, at the end of their service contract, were given seedlings and a plot of land so they could farm and support their families. Why are these free slave stories so important? Because in later years, these exact group of people would help the poor and destitute slaves who had no option for freedom or human rights escape to freedom. A well-known example of this is Anna Murray, a free African-American living in Baltimore, who helped the famous Frederick Douglass, statesman, orator, author, and social reformer, a person who helped to shape the abolitionist movement, escape to freedom, and would later marry him. Let's now turn our attention back to the timeline where we find John Punch, the first recorded man to be sentenced to slave for life, along with 2 other indentured servants, James and Victor. This is a significant event in the U.S. slavery history because the other 2 servants were white Europeans in the exact same position and status of the indentured servant. All 3 fled for their lives. When captured, only after a few days, all 3 received whippings and added 4 years to James's and Victor's indentured servants' contracts. John Punch alone was sentenced to lifelong slavery purely because he was black. That really hits home, defining the stark contrast of how prejudice alone is such a cruel and unfair judge. Punch will become the poster child for black people all over the new land who tried to flee such vile bondage. Even though in later years, stricter and stricter fugitive laws would be passed and enforced, fleeing would remain one of the most common tactics among these desperate humans to escape from the inhumane conditions they were unfairly put in. Join us next time for more Liber-Tea episodes where we dive in deeper and expose more of these heinous crimes. Like, subscribe, share, and comment to keep this important conversation at the surface, lest we forget and we become doomed to repeat such abhorrent acts.